So the 1980s sci-fi classic Robocop is finally coming to the 4K format. If you're in the US, you're going to have to wait until the 12th of April, but over here in the UK, for once, we actually got an earlier release than you guys, and we got it on the 28th. I managed to get my hands on this 4K box set version of Robocop in 4K, but I did, however, already have the 1080p Steelbook that Arrow released. So I suppose the big question is it worth upgrading to 4K? Let's find out. Just quickly though, before we dive into the technical specs of Robocop on 4K, I probably should introduce myself. I'm Andy and this is Electric Geek. On this channel I mainly cover 4K Blu-ray, I do Steelbook unboxings, and I also cover home cinema tech and a little bit gaming too. So if you're into that kind of thing and you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing so you don't miss my future content when it drops. So as I mentioned earlier, I did indeed pick up the 4K box set from Arrow of Robocop. But to be fair, that was always going to happen regardless of reviews or whatever, because I'm a massive fanboy of Robocop. It's probably my second favourite film behind Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, and I think it's just a pillar of 80s sci-fi and the sci-fi genre in general. It's definitely up there trading punches with the likes of Predator, The Thing, Aliens, Terminator, all those big hitters. Robocop more than holds its own against those guys, and for me, as I say, it's my favourite. It's a film that's aged like a fine wine. Yeah, okay, it was before the days of CGI, but we had Rob Bottin and his special effects team that really brought Robocop as a cyborg to life, as well as all the gory kind of special effects that occur in the film. It's very, very violent, and some people might not be able to see past that. However, I've always seen the violence in Robocop as a bit of a metaphor, and it's reflective of when it was made in the 80s. The whole yuppie scene when it was all about capitalism and it was all about greed. And I think that the really over-the-top, grotesque violence, as I say, is a bit of a metaphor for the greed and the over-the-topness, if you like, of the 80s in itself. So I think it's actually quite clever, and it's not just there for the sake of it. There's also a lot of humour in the film, and that's usually tied in to the over-the-top violence. But yeah, there's a lot of themes in Robocop that are still relevant to this day. It's a bit of a social commentary, and it's probably relevant now more than ever. So it just never gets old, and that sadly was what was lacking from the sequels. That's what they never quite grasped, and that's why the original is still the best by a country mile. But that's enough of my love for Robocop. Should you want to have a closer look at this 4K box set, I have actually done an unboxing already on the channel, and there will be a link in the description for that video once you finish watching this one. So please feel free to check that one out. Now let's talk about the picture quality of this release of Robocop on 4K. So Robocop already had a 4K mastering. The original negative was scanned, overseen by MGM Studios, because they own Robocop, although they've now been bought over by Amazon, but that's another story. And that resulted in a remastered release in 2014 of the movie, and subsequently an Arrow release as well, with all the usual special features and bells and whistles that Arrow bring to the fore. It was an exceptional 4K mastering of the movie, and fans of the film were really spoiled with it, and it still holds up to this day. This mastering that I'm talking about is the one that they've used to produce this native 4K disc of Robocop, and Arrow have got third-party studios in basically to do the HDR10 and Dolby Vision colour gradings of the new 4K disc. So unfortunately here kind of lies the problem with this 4K release, and that is that the Blu-ray was already very, very good. So it had stiff competition right from the start. The good news is though that Dolby Vision definitely does add something over the existing Blu-ray. There is specular highlight there. Robocop's armour shines and is much more realised with HDR, as is contrast. The blacks and the nighttime scenes, of which there are quite a lot of in Robocop, are definitely much more dynamic, especially when it comes to, you know, your typical street lighting, car headlamps, muzzle flare explosions, like the big petrol station explosion in the midway point of the film. Definitely is a bit more eye-searing and a bit more spectacular, basically. When it comes to the actual 4K resolution, as I say, the Blu-ray was so good that you really do have to get the old magnifying glass out here to see much of a difference in the 4K. It is better to my eye, but I think for casual viewers, or you know, even for me, if you chopped and changed over and over again, I'd really have to study the TV to try and pick resolution-wise what was the, from a still image certainly, what was the 4K and what was the 1080p Blu-ray. So when it comes to the stop motion stuff or the director's cut scenes that are, you know, from the old degraded source, there's only so much they can do. It is a case of kind of polishing a turd, for lack of a better expression. So sadly, Dick Jones falling out of the building at the end of the film still looks absolutely terrible. And yes, he still does have chimpanzee arms. I have taken some screenshots of my TV with both the 1080p Blu-ray and the 4K in, and I've kept the camera exactly as is. I haven't changed any picture settings on the TV, and I haven't tampered with the photographs once they've been taken. I know it's a crude experiment, however, it's just to give a kind of point of reference, and if it didn't reflect what I actually see when I'm watching, then I wouldn't use them, and I'll talk you through them. So this first image of Peter Weller in the police station, to look at, it's very difficult to tell them apart. However, obviously the top one's your Blu-ray and the bottom one is your 4K. Now, on the top one, if you look at the skin tones, it's a very good picture. It's really difficult to nitpick it, but if you look at his skin tones, there is an overall slight waxiness to it. It's a little bit softer and just a little bit more saturated. If you look at the bottom image in the 4K, I think there's a little bit more nuance to the skin tones, more variation across his face, and it's a little bit more detailed. It's not as soft and it's not as waxy. If you look into the characters in the foreground, you'll notice that their clothing is a little bit brighter on the 4K. And if you look at the hair on the female just to the right of the screen, you'll notice on the Blu-ray there's a little bit of black crush going on there. It's just a kind of black blob, whereas on the 4K you can see more strands of her hair. So it's a little bit nuanced, and the shadow detail isn't being crushed as much. But you really are splitting hairs. I really had to think about that one to explain the differences and really scrutinise that image. And then onto the final image, again, it's just another example of the black crush, probably a better example than the last one. Again, if you look up to the kind of left-hand side of the screen, the ceiling of the police office, it's really pretty dark and there's not much detail there at all. Whereas if you look at the 4K, you'll see there's actually a vent in the ceiling, which is almost completely lost in the 1080p Blu-ray because of the black crush and the over saturation. But again, there is absolutely nothing wrong with that 1080p image. It's really difficult to pick them apart resolution wise. There's nothing there. I would say as you're actually watching it, obviously the moving image is a bit different. The grain structure is a bit better, a bit more refined in the 4K. And there's just that HDR goodness, that sparkly goodness that you can't quite get across in a still image that you obviously see in the moving image when you're watching it. You'll just have to take my word for it on that. So when it comes to picture quality for Robocop in 4K, I've given it 3 out of 5. Now that might seem a bit harsh. Had there only ever been a 4K release of it and that Blu-ray didn't exist, I would have given it 5 out of 5 all day long. But the Blu-ray is so good that the competition is stiff, so I feel we've got to think about it as someone upgrading, and therefore it's just a 3 out of 5. There is a difference, but not a massive difference, so that's why I've scored it like that. On the audio side of things, we have a Dolby Atmos track this time around. Now on the previous Blu-ray, as far as channels went, we got as high as 5.1, and the 5.1 DTS HD soundtrack was absolutely fine. As I say, I'd watched it in my home cinema setup before, and it is good. I was quite happy with it. I was excited to see how it would sound on Dolby Atmos because I absolutely love the Basil Poledouris score for this movie, and as I say, it's one of my favourite movies, so if I can hear it better than I had before, then I'm all in. So I was excited about the Dolby Atmos. The Dolby Atmos has obviously been taken from the original 4-track source, and it's been upmixed again by a third-party company working for Arrow. Usually with these older films, when they throw Atmos onto it or they try and make an Atmos mix, it's never going to be obviously as dynamic as, say, for example, No Way Home that's just come out there, or Ready Player One's a good example. It's got a fantastic, really dynamic Atmos soundtrack, which has obviously been, you know, designed with that in mind, whereas they're trying to go off of stuff that was recorded back in the 1980s and then turn it into Atmos. It's never going to sound as good as a modern movie. However, it is a big upgrade, I think, over the 5.1 DTS HD track. Straight away, it's just much more balanced and the dialogue is much easier to make out. Just to give it a bit of reference, I always listen to my movies on 15 in my home cinema setup, and that's what I had this on. Dialogue was very clear and it was very loud. You know, that dynamic range was good. Whenever it needed to be loud, it jumped up, but it never ever drowned out the dialogue, I felt. Just to test though, I listened to some scenes across all the different audio tracks. So started off with the Atmos, went down to the 5.1, then the 4-channel, then the 2-channel, and the dialogue is definitely not as clear across those lesser tracks. I found myself having to pump those ones up closer to 18, 19 to hear the dialogue with the same clarity that I could hear the Atmos track on at 15. So definitely an improvement in that regard. But highlights for me, as I say, were the Basil Poledouris score. During the drive montage, that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was just fantastic hearing it with that upgraded Atmos track. Another scene that really made me sit up and pay attention was the reveal of Ed 209 in chapter 2 of the movie. That robotic grill that Ed 209 gives off is fantastic in Atmos, and it really makes him more intimidating than ever. All the different shootouts in the movie are excellent in Atmos, as I say, maybe not as dynamic as a modern movie, but you hear all the gunfire and all the different channels, and it's very engaging, very immersive. So when it comes to the Dolby Atmos track on Robocop, I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5. I can't give it a 5 out of 5 because it's not like demo material or anything. As I say, it is an old score from the 1980s, but it's a very good upgrade and it's considerably better than what we had on the previous Blu-ray, the 5.1 track. So definitely a thumbs up when regards to the Atmos. When it comes to your special features on this 4K release, sadly there is absolutely nothing new whatsoever on the 4K release. It is pretty much just a copy and paste job of the old 1080p box set that they released, and the same goes for the Steelbook. That is the 1080p Steelbook obviously, but there is a 4K version which I would imagine will be identical. Good news is though that if you don't have either of these and it's the first time you're buying Robocop on Blu-ray or 4K, is that there is an absolute raft of cracking special features which I've already watched, but there isn't anything new. Some of them are now in 4K because it's the 4K discs. That's a good point actually. I should mention that you don't get the accompanying Blu-rays. It is just the 4Ks, so you're getting the director's cut and the theatrical cut on this. But yeah, as you can see now on the screen, there's a quick list. I'm not going to go through them all, be here all day, but plenty of special features if you're a fan of the film that will keep you going for hours and hours. So with all that said, ultimately, can I recommend that you upgrade to Robocop on 4K? To put it bluntly, and it breaks my heart, I have to say no. I don't think, purely as a 4K disc, technically, it's enough of a jump forward from the already fantastic Blu-ray. I am a super fan of the movie, and I wanted it in 4K. I was always going to get it regardless. It is a good 4K transfer. I think it looks nice on the Blu-ray. It's certainly, the 4K is certainly one that I'm going to be watching. When it comes to the audio, the Dolby Atmos is probably the biggest step up, I think, if you've got a home cinema setup that can do it justice. If you are like me and you're a big fan and you want to double dip, then the only bit of advice I would give you is go for whatever one you don't have. So I was, as it turns out, quite sensible, and I already had the 1080p Steelbook. So I went for the box set so that I would have a bit of variation, and I'm quite happy with that. I think if you had the box set 1080p and you upgraded to this, you would feel like you'd wasted your money a little bit, because it is literally just the same thing and there's not enough of a difference in the disc itself. But if you don't have Robocop on Blu-ray and you're upgrading from DVD, or you've just never owned it in a physical format, I can absolutely recommend that you get, you know, the Steelbook or the 4K box set. It is a cracking box set, it's just that it already existed basically on a very good Blu-ray. That's why sadly I can't recommend you upgrade to it. I'm not saying that if you do, you're not going to be happy. Obviously it's subjective, this review is subjective, I'm not an expert. I'm trying my best to give you the heads up. But I can't sit here and let my fanboy love for the movie get in the way and tell you, yeah, get Robocop in 4K, it's absolutely fantastic, it's going to blow you away, because for the majority, it's just not going to blow people away. But yeah, let me know in the comments if you decided to pick it up. Did you upgrade from the Blu-ray, or are you jumping on it for the first time? Either way, let me know your thoughts on the movie and this 4K release. So I've been Andy Electric Geek, thanks very much for watching. Remember, you can check the unbox out here of this Robocop box set, or you can have a look at some other 4K reviews. Alright, cheers, take care, and I'll see you in the next video.